At Home Radio. Creator and presenter, Kate Jones. Music, video, produced by Jonathan, the producer.
Hello, this is At Home Radio, a welcoming place for insight, truth, and exuberance. I'm Kate Jones, and today I'm talking with Leonard Jones, no relation, author of At the Bat, The Strikeout That Shamed America, published in 2020 and available on Amazon. Welcome, Del. It is so great to meet you.
Thank you, Kate. Nice to meet you, too.
Yeah, it's fun to have you on the show. Already, I can tell. Goodreads ranks At the Bat number 9 on its list of the 112 greatest baseball novels of all time. Boy, you probably felt pretty good about that.
Yeah.
Of course.
It's a surprise, yeah.
Well, it is. It's very well written, and it's a great story.
Oh, thank you.
And your book is certainly in good company. The Natural, famous book, is number 1.
Right.
At the Bat is a sweeping historical novel based on the well-known poem Casey at the Bat, which was published in 1888. The poet, Ernest Thayer, referred to Casey at the Bat not as a poem, but as a ballad of the Republic, sung in the year 1888. Why did he call it a ballad?
You know, I'm not really sure. I think people still refer to poems that have a story to them as ballads. That's one reason. And the other reason is 1888, it wasn't quite the point of yellow journalism yet. That just came a few years later. But it was when there was no radio, there was no television. Newspapers were basically king, but it was highly competitive. I mean, New York City had over 100 daily newspapers, and this was published in the San Francisco Examiner. But there was just a lot of competition, so everything was kind of like, it's almost like clickbait today. Headlines and stuff were kind of like beefed up a little bit to sell newspapers. And so I would imagine that the ballad of 1898 just sounded better than a poem.
Yes,
that somebody scribbled down in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very strong ring to it.
Yeah.
And the poem's last line is so familiar. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. I don't know. It seems like everybody knows that line. Why did you choose to write a novel based on this poem?
Well, it's my second novel based on a poem. The first one was The Cremation of Sam McGee, which was also based on a ballad, a poem with a story. And one reason is my father, who just died a month ago at 95.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He had these poems memorized. A lot of people back in his day, memorized poetry in school. It was part of the school curriculum. And so a lot of people, in fact, I have a Google alert set up for Casey at the Bat and The Cremation of Sam McGee. And I get, anytime something lands in the news with these words in it, I get an email from Google, and it's always, I get them regularly, and it's always somebody's obituary. And these poems were so important to them that when they boiled down their life into a few paragraphs for an obituary, the poems often made it because they had them memorized. And they would recite them like on their 50th wedding anniversary or whatever. All their children were just amazed that they could recite these poems. And so that's one reason. That's the main reason I did it on the poems. And the second reason is I consider myself a pretty good writer. But as a journalist, I never had to create like a novel-length fictional story out of thin air. And so I use these to give me kind of a base of a story. From there, I expanded heavily on what actually happened in the poems, but it gave me kind of a place to start from rather than just create something out of thin air.
That makes sense. It gives you the skeleton, to hang everything on. That's very interesting. Well, the poem itself was quite popular in its time. And now, today, there are readings of it all over, on YouTube, all over. And one I listened to. I listened to more than one, but one, in fact, is by James Earl Jones, complete with this dramatic score befitting this, absolutely dramatic reading. What do you think resonates with people about this tale of mighty Casey striking out?
Yeah, it's really, it's only 13 stanzas long, but it's really a good story because of the twist. I mean, basically the story in the poem is about, if Casey could just get up to bat, he would win the game. But there's 2 outs and there's 2 like really weak hitters in front of him. So it just kind of builds the tension because everybody just expects these 2 weak hitters not to get on so Casey can get up. And lo and behold, they do get on. And so Casey gets up and now, naturally he's going to win the game. But then he strikes out on 3 pitches, 2 called strikes and the last swing. It's just the twist at the end. If Casey had hit the walk-off home run, I don't think we would be talking about the poem. Right. I don't think anybody would have ever remembered it.
Yeah, we wouldn't be talking about mighty Casey. So no. It is, it's fun. It is a good twist. So why did you subtitle your book, The Strikeout That Shamed America?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and it kind of has to do with the ending, and I don't want to spoil it.
Tell it. Okay.
But essentially, it's, I kind of used Casey as kind of this kind of person that in his time that everybody just loved and adored and worshiped. But in his personal life, he's a little bit different. He's kind of like what you would think of kind of a famous person today, a singer or an actor or even an athlete who is, in his public life, everybody just adores him. But in his private life, he's something else. And so I kind of made him kind of a dark character in the book that only the reader kind of finds out about. The public doesn't really know. Right.
And I think people can think of many contemporary figures who match that and that description. And also, I'm still in the process of reading the book, but already I can tell what you're doing. You're slipping that in, a little bit here, a little bit there. And it is, I just want to reiterate, it's a really good book. And I do plan on finishing the whole thing. It's one of those books, it's my book in progress right now which I read whenever I have a moment. And so that's not always, it's a snatch of time here, a snatch of time there.
I know the feeling, yeah.
Yes. Don't we all? I mean, lives, even during, when there's not a lot going on, there's still a lot going on. I don't know
right.
how else to.
A lot of distractions, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. So how did you go about researching and writing At the Bat?
Essentially, I'd spent my career as a reporter and I decided, I've interviewed the last person, although I'm now freelancing, so I'm still interviewing people. But when I decided to write the novel, I wanted to go back enough in time where I didn't have to interview anybody. 1888, nobody's still alive that lived in 1888, but there was plenty of research material. And essentially, I just read a lot of newspapers back in that time to get kind of the flavor of the vocabulary they used and what baseball is like. I mean, it was the game. There was, the other sports weren't that big as baseball back then. So a lot of newspaper articles about not about Casey, but about baseball in general. In fact, baseball was spelled with 2 words back then. Now you read the newspapers and it's baseball, 2 words. Mm-hmm. And I actually kept that in the novel. And I think when you might have stumbled on it when you first start reading it, first time you see it, baseball, 2 words, typo, and then it just keeps going like that. And finally, mm-hmm. I think the brain kind of like adjusts to it. But I think it was like...
Yeah, I like that ahead. Actually, because it felt very much in its time, even though, I didn't know that it was, you just get that from the context of it.
Right. Yeah. I tried to stay with the vocabulary, like the word fan comes from fanatic, and they actually called fans fanatics back then. So I called them fanatics in the novel as well.
So interesting. And it's so interesting that poems in newspapers were used as fillers in the old days of newspapering when pages were composed with metal hot type. Do you think that that is one of the reasons these poems reached a general audience in those days?
Yeah, they were used. Newspapers back then, they didn't have like wire services. As time went by, newspapers, when they, all their local reporters had written, they filled what part of the paper they did with their local reporting. They basically used wire services, kind of national news, to fill it out. That's what they do now. But back then they didn't have that. And so they had these things like when they got to like the bottom of a page and there was like just too much white space. If there was a little bit, they had a way with the typesetting to kind of stretch things out and stuff. So they used things like recipes and poems and that kind of thing. They're basically just stuff to, and I went back and I found the actual newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, that had the poem in it. And you can tell exactly that it was stuffed in because it was called, back then it was called huddling, when all the letters look kind of like scrunched together. And if you look at the poem in the original paper, that's the way it is. It's like the poem just didn't quite fit in this hole at the bottom of page 4. And the letters are all kind of like scrunched up and that kind of thing. And it was written with such haste that, all the poems that you see, in books and on the internet have been corrected for this. But the original poem, one of the weak hitters that got on, base ahead of Casey was Jimmy Blake. And in the original poem, he was Jimmy Blake in one stanza, and the next stanza, he was Johnny Blake. So you could tell it was like hurried so much that nobody even bothered to copy read it that much, for the first name to be different. So you can tell it was just kind of a second thought. In fact, the original poet, Ernest Thayer, he signed the poem Finn, Phin, and didn't even admit that he wrote the poem for a few years. He was a Harvard graduate, and it was just kind of beneath him that anybody would associate that poem with him.
But then later
now that is what he's famous for. Yeah, we wouldn't know him without the poem. Yeah,
right.
I think it's the only poem he ever wrote. He went back home and ran his family's textile business.
That's so fascinating. Was he working at the paper at the time?
Yeah, he was a friend of the publisher of the newspaper. They'd gone to Harvard together, and so it was kind of like, I'll go like an internship today. I'll just go like work the summer at the newspaper, and then I'll go home and run my family business kind of thing. And so that's what he was doing.
I see. Okay.
It was William Randolph Hearst was he's now a famous publisher. The San Francisco he was actually very young when his father was a silver millionaire at the time. He was very rich on silver, and he bought the San Francisco Examiner as something that he might use to go into politics. Back then, if you were rich and you wanted to go into politics, you bought a newspaper, and so he bought the Examiner for that. And didn't pay any attention and didn't go into politics, and then just gave the newspaper to his son. He was in his 20-somethings, William Randolph Hearst, as a gift. And
oh my gosh!
And it was kind of a losing newspaper, but William Randolph Hearst turned the newspaper around into a big circulation boom, and then eventually wound up buying newspapers all over the world, including the New York World, which was the biggest newspaper became the biggest newspaper in New York at that time.
Quite fascinating. Well, back to you. You and your wife live in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and you worked at USA Today, which is headquartered in nearby McLean, Virginia. So you worked there for a number of years, and you're a Pulitzer Prize nominee for beat reporting at USA Today. Would you mind talking about your journalism career?
Yeah, it wasn't in sports, which is probably what people would imagine. I actually started out of college as a sports writer for a couple of small newspapers, and I realized that the kind of the progression, at least back when I was starting out in journalism, is you started at the really small newspaper and you tried to work your way up to larger newspapers, and I wasn't moving up as fast as I wanted to. And it's just like kind of like they say that the fastest way to the major leagues in baseball is to be a catcher. The fastest way to a major publication was to be a business or a financial reporter, and I had an interest in that. In fact, I got an MBA when I was in El Paso, And so I moved into business reporting and worked my way up to USA Today in the money section. And I became the corporate leadership reporter. And the reason I was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting was that they wanted me to do stories on executives and CEOs because they made advertising decisions. And the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, at least all the New York CEOs, that's the only newspaper they would read. And they wanted, even though USA Today was popular among general readership, these top executives weren't reading it. So they actually started this beat as corporate leadership to get these people into the paper. But I didn't want to just write stories that would only interest them. So I started writing stories about like CEOs who cheated golf and CEOs who were spanked as children. And I figured out a way to get these people to talk about it. If you call the PR department, like at Amazon, and say, can I get Jeff Bezos on the phone and have him talk about whether he was spanked as a child? They would just laugh at you and hang up. So I would be doing all these stories on things, new products and things that CEOs wanted to talk to me about. And then I would always, like they call it collecting string, I would always have these other stories in the back of my head that I was going to get to eventually. And so I would ask them at the end of the interview these questions like, do you ever cheat at golf? And, now you've got them on the phone, and they can either like say no comment or answer the question. And of course, none of them had cheated at golf. So my next question was, well, have you ever played with a CEO who cheated at golf? And, oh yeah, I play with CEOs who cheated golf all the time. And so, these stories took months to put together. But while I was doing these other stories, I was collecting string on them, and I put enough of these kind of stories together that's why I got nominated for a beat reporting, because everybody would just laugh at them. In fact, when CEOs came into the money section to be interviewed by other reporters, there was an auto beat reporter, and he would have CEOs from the auto companies come in every once in a while. And I would tell him to invite me into the meeting, and I would sit there just quietly and let the auto reporter ask all the questions he needed to. But then I would, at the end of the interview, I would say, hey, were you ever spanked as a child? And everybody else in the meeting would just roll their eyes, go, oh, there goes Del again.
That's excellent. What a great way to do the stories that way. You took a fresh angle, and that had to have been refreshing to people.
Yeah, that was my intention, was to take this beat, but make it something everybody wants to read about CEOs who were spanked or cheated at golf, but so do CEOs, they want to read about, well, yeah, I know CEOs who cheated golf. Let me read this story.
But of course, that person saying it never did.
Right.
Never.
Not one of them, no.
I think that's wonderful.